Hello and good morning. This is a very interesting story that we have here in Sharpsburg, Maryland, concerning what is called the Old Slave Block. The Old Slave Block has had some controversy lately. I've been researching the Old Slave Block in Sharpsburg for about 12 years now. In March of this year, I gave a presentation about the Old Slave Block that more or less developed some history that helped us understand more about it. And since that time, things have moved very quickly, uh, historically speaking and research-wise, and I've learned even more with the help of some other local historians, very talented people who helped me find more and more information about this. So, I'm titling this presentation Sharpsburg Slave Auction Block, A Probable Beginning. It is a work in progress. I hope you understand that. What we know today could change tomorrow. And this presentation is developed over many years of research. I appreciate your understanding of that. Here's what happens with this old slave block in Sharpsburg. People are rather committed. They either say that it was a slave auction block or that it was a carriage step. No matter which, it has an incredible history. Could both of these be true? Again, one of the big research problems with looking into the background of the old slave block in Sharpsburg is that you run into these sources constantly, no matter if a person says it's a carriage step, no matter if they say it is in fact an auction block. The references that always people seem to fall back on are someone said and I heard, or someone told me. We're going to discuss both of these, and we will draw the best reasonable inferences that we can from each in the context of what is known historically. Here's some things we know today. This is kind of an executive summary, just to start off. I hope you'll stick with me and not expect that this is the end of the story, because there's a lot more coming to this. We know, though, that this block was a carriage step, that was its purpose in being placed where it is today. We know this, that there were no large commercial auctions of enslaved people in Sharpsburg. Note this very carefully. This does not say there were no auctions of enslaved people. It says there were no large commercial auctions of enslaved people. Big difference, and we're going to talk about that. And we also know this, and this is foundational and important. There is one incident from which the block became known as a slave auction block. We will share that history with you. Now, this presentation is in two parts, part one and part two. In part one, we will discuss the different types of sales of enslaved people in Sharpsburg. What type were they? And we're talking about all different types here. We'll go through them one by one. The idea is to see if any of them could fit into the story of the old slave block. Could there be a connection between each of these different types of sales and that one location in Sharpsburg? In part two, we'll get into more of the history. Where did this stone come from? Who placed it where it is today? How did the plaque come to be on it? And we'll touch on this topic too. Was Sharpsburg a stop on the Underground Railroad? So let's get close, take a good look at this stone. Here it is, pictured as it sits on the corner in Sharpsburg, Maryland. And the words from the plaque are emboldened there. Old slave block. From 1800 to 1865, this stone was used as a slave auction block. It has been a famous landmark at this location for over 150 years. Now, if you're like me, when you take a look at that, stand there and observe that stone, you come up with some questions. And the first question that I had was, why are the dates wrong? Why does it date the end of slavery as 1865? Maryland abolished slavery by the legislature in 1863, but that became effective for January 1, 1864. 1865 was the year in which Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. But why are the dates wrong? I mean that in terms of this. If you were looking into placing a brass plaque as a monument or memorial on a stone, wouldn't you want to get it right? So I think this tells us something, gives us some clues right away about who might have done this. And I mean who in a large sense. What type of person, what type of interests they might have. And again, who placed the plaque and when? We're going to answer that for you. We firmly developed an answer to that in March of this year. Who would be careless about the dates? Who wouldn't bother to do the research that was necessary to get it right? And then one question I think everybody who passes by and takes a look at this stone says, it doesn't look like it's a comfortable place to stand. Maybe it's just an old carriage step. So you have this dichotomy because the plaque seems to suggest it is a old slave block, and makes no mention of it being a carriage step. And so, was it just a carriage step? Was it a slave auction block? Or did it have a dual purpose? We'll discuss that as we move through this presentation. All right, you may already be aware, but if you're not, the stone sits at the southwest corner of East Main Street and South Church Street in Sharpsburg. Now, this is where a man named Jacob Miller lived for 60 years, from 1815 to 1875. All right, this is a long period of time for anyone, anywhere to live. And we will talk a lot about Jacob Miller in part 2. Just so you can see, here's a map to locate the red dot where the old slave block sits on the corner that I mentioned earlier. This is an interesting map if you do any research about Sharpsburg. This is an atlas map of Sharpsburg from 1877, and in each of those little town lots, it identifies the owner. Now, I said that Jacob Miller died. Well, maybe I haven't said it yet. I'll tell you now. He died in 1875, and this map made in 1877 shows his property as in the estate of Miller. Okay, so let's jump into part 1. Part 1 is this. What types of sales of enslaved persons were held in Sharpsburg? We're going to walk through each one. We have several different types, and we, again, examine the known evidence for each type, okay? And we're asking about these at this point. These are questions. Were large commercial slave auctions held in Sharpsburg? Were there estate sales? Were there sheriff sales? And were there private sales? Again, it's a question format. Before we get to that, though, let's talk about what would, in your mind, what would constitute a slave auction? All right, is it simply one enslaved person being offered for sale, or dozens of enslaved people? For many of us, our first understanding or first exposure to what a slave auction was probably came through the presentation on television of Alex Haley's book, Roots, where Kunta Kinte arrived in Annapolis, Maryland, and there was a rather large auction of enslaved people held. Now, we're going to delve more and more deeply into this, but just keep that in mind, because you're allowed to have an idea different from me on this, all right? My idea is this. This is representative of what I would call an auction of enslaved people. This article advertisement from a Charleston, South Carolina newspaper in 1806. This lists many ships coming into the port of Charleston that will be offering enslaved people for sale at auctions. I don't think there's any doubt that this qualifies in any of our minds as an auction of enslaved people. Does that term, though, old slave block, does that infer that there was a dedicated and consistent use? In other words, this is where we went to sell enslaved people. Or does it mean that just sometimes there were enslaved people? In other words, there may have been multiple locations around the town of Sharpsburg where auctions like this were held. Which does it mean? I think that there's a tendency to take a look at that block and without any other knowledge to assume that this was the place, even though that may not be true. Also, when I think about what a slave auction is, this is the type of information that I see. Okay, now this happens to be what is called an estate sale. Okay, an estate sale is the selling off of the property of a person who is deceased so that their estate can be settled amongst numerous heirs. And here we have an ad for a farm in Jefferson County, not far from Shepherdstown, called the Bower. The Bower is a famous estate. It still stands in Jefferson County. And this wealthy gentleman, A.S. Dandridge, Esquire, has deceased, and amongst his property you will see 80 slaves, okay, of both sexes and all ages. And at the same time, they're going to auction off household and kitchen furniture, library, etc. All right. I think with the great number of enslaved people being offered here, you could say, yes, this is an estate sale, but you could also say this is an auction of enslaved people too. Now, 10, 12 years ago, when I started to really think seriously about the old slave block, I started off with the idea, I wonder if there were large commercial auctions of enslaved people traveling through Sharpsburg, stopping at that location, using that block for auctions of enslaved persons. That's what I wondered. And I thought if that happened, that there would need to be advertisements to draw a crowd of people. If you're going to have a lot of enslaved people offered for sale, you're going to need a lot of buyers. And so I thought, well, how would they attract them? And it must have been, at least my conclusion was at that time, and I think it still holds today, that they would be offered by advertisements placed in newspapers. So I've been undertaking this search for years now, looking at online collections of archived newspapers, and I've been tracking ads that I've found. This particular ad ran for many weeks in a number of different newspapers in Charlestown, Martinsburg, Hagerstown, and Shepherdstown. Do you see the type of publicity that's needed to attract people to what I'm calling large commercial auctions of enslaved people? If this was taking place in Sharpsburg, if it was, then advertisements like this would be necessary. And so I undertook to try to find those in these archived newspapers. And here are some different search terms that I used throughout these years. And I've used them in all different combinations to try to pull in as many as I possibly could. And here is a list of newspapers that I consistently searched. 3 from Hagerstown, 1 Cumberland paper, a Frederick paper, a Shepherdstown paper, and a Charlestown paper. You can see there the dates that each of those papers was published. You can see also the number of ads or articles that I found in each one. And I did not find amongst any of these an ad or article for a large commercial auction of enslaved people in Sharpsburg. Remember, that's what I was targeted towards, large commercial auctions of enslaved people in Sharpsburg. But there were other databases too, somewhat larger because these are collections. In Western Maryland's Historical Library Newspapers Index, there are about 300 different articles that match those search terms. Now, these did not every single one of them mentioned a sale of any kind, all right? It may have just pulled in some of the search terms. There's also the Washington County Free Library Historical Newspaper Index, same thing, 1790 to 1890, about 700 articles that matched some of the search terms, all right? And not one ad was found for a large-scale commercial slave auction in Sharpsburg. And that, I think, is very telling, because what we can conclude from that is that that did not take place in Sharpsburg. And that makes sense for a lot of reasons. Now, we're not saying there were no sales of enslaved people in Sharpsburg or that there were no auctions. We're talking about large-scale commercial slave auctions. If you use the same search terms that I used for newspapers in Baltimore, Richmond, Charleston, or New Orleans, you will find many large commercial slave auctions in operation. And as I said, in answer to this question, is it likely the stone was used for large commercial auctions of enslaved people? No, based on the absence of advertisements promoting those sales, the answer is no. So we've taken one step, but we have a lot further to go. There were ads found for other types of sales of enslaved people. We did find these, and we're going to go through them and show you examples. We found sheriff sales advertisements, estate sales, you've already seen one. Sometimes they're called orphans court sales. And we found private sales. Remember, a private sale is not an auction. A private sale is where there is a seller who's offering an enslaved person for sale. Someone responds to his ad, they negotiate a price, and the transaction is complete. So there's no need for a carriage step or auction block of any kind for a private sale. Did sales like these, each type of these, occur in Sharpsburg? Well, let's look. Here's an ad for a sheriff's sale at the premises. Now keep in mind, this type, and we're going to talk about it, this type of sale did take place at the premises. Whose premises? The premises of a debtor. This ad tells us that there was a lawsuit filed by a gentleman, George I. Harry, who sued a man named Jacob Waltz. Obviously, Harry received a judgment in this case. And Harry, in order to receive payment for the judgment, requested an order to have the sheriff seize property of Waltz. And he did. The sheriff did go to Waltz's home and seized his enslaved people, consisting of men, women, and children. Also, there was some wheat and rye. Note some things about this. This ad is dated as being placed November 22nd, and it is running to 21 December 1824, okay, which is the date of the auction itself. Now, this legal document is called a writ of fieri facias, and that's the order that allows the sheriff to seize property. Remember, these are going to take place at the home of the debtor, right where the debtor lives, okay? This is really important. Another type of sale. Now, we've already seen one. We saw the A.S. Dandridge sale at the Bower. This one is slightly different. This is an estate sale, sometimes called a public sale. And where are these types of sales held? They are held at the premises. Okay, they are held at the premises. This ad is from a Hagerstown newspaper from 1827. Happens to be for property of Thomas Shepard, deceased, um, living just 2 miles above the Antietam Iron Works. All right, 2 miles above the Antietam Iron Works along the Potomac River. Today we know this area as Miller's Sawmill. Okay, approximately there, maybe even slightly above that towards Shepherdstown. And here you see property being offered for sale. The house is for sale, a barn is for sale, and at the same time, a valuable female slave, a clock, and other household furniture. Um, this type of sale, remember, is going to be held at the home of the deceased. Now, here is a public sale. This is a type of auction at a private residence near Sharpsburg. Okay, um, and that's somewhat misleading because when you read the ad itself, it says on the road leading from Sharpsburg to Traptown and near the Old Valley Meeting House. I have been able to get the help of many people locally who've pointed me in the direction of somewhere in the vicinity of Jefferson, Maryland. Okay, so it's not quite near Sharpsburg. It's over the mountain in Frederick County in the Jefferson area. But this is an auction that promotes the sale of 7 enslaved people. It happens, it's called a public sale. You see that at the head of the ad, but it is also an estate sale. An estate sale can be called a public sale, but not all public sales are estate sales. Sometimes people just auction off property just to liquidate the property and to receive cash. Now, this is an example of a private sale. Keep in mind, a private sale does not mean an auction. This is where a seller is offering something for sale, places an ad in a newspaper, and hopefully for the seller, he gets some responses and a transaction is completed. And I've outlined in red the items of importance for sale while I clip this. He will also sell or hire all of his slaves, 3 boys and 1 girl, from 7 to 12 years of age, who will be put out to good places immediately for a term for their board and clothing. And then he goes on, the others will be disposed of towards the spring. In other words, he has other enslaved people that he will be offering for sale, enslaved persons, later towards the spring. Okay, this ad from September of 1828, referring to a springtime sale. So there must have been some need for the seller to retain those enslaved people until that later date. Let's get to this. Were sheriff sales of enslaved people conducted in Sharpsburg? Of course, yes. We know that sales of property were seized under this writ of fieri facias and were conducted at the residence of the judgment debtor. But we did not find any ads for a sheriff's sale on the corner where the stone is located. Okay? There's another type of sheriff's sale. That's a sale of enslaved persons seeking freedom who were captured in Washington County. They would be turned over to the sheriff. The sheriff would send notice to the owners telling them to come to take their enslaved persons home. And if they did not, then, well, the sheriff was entitled to sell them at auction. This happens to be the Washington County Sheriff's slave auction block that was in Hagerstown and is now in the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. Were there public sales of property, including enslaved people in and near Sharpsburg? Yes, although we did not find any ads for sales like that in Sharpsburg. It's hard to imagine they did not take place. In other words, the type of sale that I mentioned, where someone was just liquidating property. Um, those types of sales, imagine this, they would have been on a smaller scale. There were not large estates in Sharpsburg in pre-Civil War times. There were small farms and small households. And so the amount of property being offered would not have been quite large, would have been smaller. They would not have needed to be advertised. It may have been enough to get the word out locally. Um, no need for continual advertisement or placement in larger newspapers. And consider this, public sales were generally held at a private residence. Now, we are in a day and age where we are all familiar with auctions being held at an auctioneer's place of business. I attend them sometimes, maybe you do too. They're not at a private residence. Sometimes they can be, but many times these auctioneers have large ongoing auctions right at their own places of business. And Sharpsburg did have a few persons who were auctioneers. Consider this, wood to stone, this stone that sits on the corner. Is it possible that some auctioneer had that as his stone and he moved it around for auctions at residences because he needed a platform? Personally, I think that's doubtful. All right, the estimates on the weight of that stone that I've heard are 1,200 to 1,500 pounds. It would have been possible to move it with great effort, but I don't think it's likely that it was done and that it eventually landed there on the corner of Church and Main Street in Sharpsburg. So, what do we know? What have we acquired through part one? We know there were no large commercial slave auctions in Sharpsburg. We didn't find any ads for those, and the ads needed to be placed and run for a period of time in order to draw the people who would have been necessary to support and sustain large commercial auctions like that. We also know through what we've learned about these different types of auctions that this carriage stone, this old slave block, was not a dedicated place for auctions, right? We walked through each type and found where those are held. The sheriff's sale of freedom seeking enslaved, those were held in Hagerstown. These other types of sales, uh, sheriff sales of a debtor's property and public sales, estate sales, those are held at residences, okay? So we know that that block there on the corner wasn't a dedicated place. Could it have been a one-off? We're going to talk about that. We know, and this is just other information related to our inquiry, Sharpsburg had a relatively small trade in enslaved people, person to person, and not in great numbers. And we know again that the sheriff sales, public sales, estate sales, and private sales took place at residences. So it would not have been the carriage stone, the old slave block, was not a place that was dedicated for auctions. That's what we know as we go through part one. Now let's move into part two. And let's take up these next questions, okay? We talked about this a little bit. Could the stone have been a fixture that was used by a Sharpsburg auctioneer at his place of business? We'll touch on that a little bit more. Where did it come from? We'll answer that for you. Who placed it where it is today? We'll have a theory on that. We won't get to a who by name. And how did the brass plate come to be placed on it? Directly, we're going to address that. Lee Barron. Lee Barron was a Sharpsburg historian. And Lee wrote a nice small book called The History of Sharpsburg. If you see one, pick it up. It's a soft cover book. The ones that I have seen and the one that I have has a yellow cover on it. And he presented information or told us about the old slave block in his book. But all he did was he used the words from the brass plate fixed to the stone. Now we've examined those. But he left us with a huge conundrum. Lee's notes for his book survive. And this is a photograph of the notes from that he used to write the section about the old slave block. Okay, it says in red that he thinks the stone was a carriage step. It's believed by the author to be a stepping stone used by persons to get up on a horse. He also mentions this Mr. Clifford Swain of Hagerstown, but Clifford Swain grew up in Sharpsburg. He says Clifford Swain told him that there was a slave block at the corner of Chapline and Church Streets, and he remembered it as being several feet high and about 3 feet across. Now I want you to pause. I want you to stop and think. That should make you think. That sounds like a platform. That sounds like something someone could stand on comfortably, whether it's an auctioneer or whether it's an enslaved person. Either of them, probably both, could occupy that space if it's that size. Okay, and then he goes on in the lower section. Clifford Swain remembered the stepping stones, the carriage stones he means, were also remembered. There was one at most of the street intersections and at the town square. So these were common, these stepping stones, these carriage stones. They were around town. And they've disappeared with time, probably with the widening of streets, probably with the establishment of real sidewalks in town, and certainly any place where they would have interfered with traffic, they would have been removed over time. So we have two now that survive, the one that we see on the corner of Church and Main Street, and then just west of the square along the north side of West Main Street. You see another example, actually a very nice example of a carriage step there. A little bit about Clifford Swain. As I said, he was from Sharpsburg, born in 1890 and died in Hagerstown in 1974. Lived to be 84. He was for a time a boatman on the C&O Canal. I found this picture in doing research about slave auction blocks. This one happens to be from a location near Lynchburg, Virginia, from a large farm. I hesitate to use the word plantation, but it was a larger farm in that area that was known to have enslaved people as a labor force. And I think somewhat of the description provided by Clifford Swain describes something like this, although I don't see that surface as being 3 feet across on the top for standing, but something like that, high and wider than these steps of stepping stones that we see. And so we're curious, are there any other in our area? Now we've identified two in Sharpsburg. Let's take a look across the river in Shepherdstown. Well, here's one, right at the front gate of a home in Shepherdstown. And another, number 2. You can see that one's carved to be like a step. This one, not so much a step with steps, but would have been used to alight from a horse or a carriage. Another one at a corner in a prominent location just off of Main Street, 1 block off of Main Street, I think they call it. Here's another that was at a corner, same general area as the others on the south side of German Street, 1 block away from German Street to the south. And then here's another. This one has suffered some weathering over time and interestingly has split. And driving through Funkstown one day, I noticed this right outside the town hall. And this is the location where it is today. I think without a lot of speculation that this probably was a carriage step. Now, as I moved through this research, I did find this is the first article that I found about the old slave block with the brass plate on it. It was from November 30, 1958. It's from the Baltimore Sun. Interesting, the gas station opened a year before in 1957. And I've quoted some of the words there. You can't see it in the actual article, but I wrote it out there for you. On a street corner in Sharpsburg, Maryland, where it is seen by many of the visitors to nearby Antietam battlefield, stands a carved block of stone, that symbolizes the entire Civil War. It is an old slave auction block. So this was first, and it didn't get me very far, but it led me to this next one. And now we're getting somewhere, because this is from June 21, 1957. Again, I apologize you can't read that section in red, but I have blown it up on the next slide and we will look at it. This picture shows on the left a man named Walter Snyder, who, along with two other gentlemen, one named Harold 20 on the right, those two other gentlemen work for Sinclair Oil Refining Company. They're going to build a gas station on the corner where Jacob Miller's home was. And they go into the home. There's Mr. Snyder showing them this trap door that he is explaining to them was told to him this was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Now, we're going to talk about that possibility as we move along in this story. Here's the section in red that you could not read before. Harold 20, sales representative of the Sinclair Refining Company, will lease the gas station to be built on the location. Says present plans call for exhibiting some of the relics at the station when it is completed. They were playing up the Civil War angle and some of the relics that they found, they said, related to the Civil War. I referred to my presentation from March 12th of this year. And at that moment when I saw this, I started to think that maybe it was Sinclair that put the brass plaque on the stone. We'll discuss that a bit more. Okay, so let's turn back to Lee Barron's, Lee Barron referred to Clifford Swain, who remembered a platform at that location in yellow. Who lived at that location? All right. Now, at this, you can't read it here, but in that little square, it says Morgan Miller lived there, M. Miller. Morgan Miller was the son of Jacob Miller. We haven't talked a lot about Jacob Miller, so let's do that now. He had a distinguished military career in the War of 1812. He was a farmer in the Sharpsburg area. Now, he owned a lot of land, okay? Lived where the stone has been located with the plaque on it. Morgan Miller's father. Interesting, look at this. Owned enslaved people. In 1850, he owned 10. In 1860, he was down to 2. Now, Jacob Miller was opposed to Lincoln. He called Lincoln and the Union Party, he called them the party of disunion. He supported secession, and he was very vocal even during the outbreak of war in the area. And remember, the area was occupied mostly by the Potomac Home Brigade, and anytime he spoke out, Jacob Miller spoke out about his support for secession or the rebels, periodically he would be arrested and he'd be held for a day or two, and then they would release him and tell him, look, be quiet, don't be so vocal. But more important than any part of this, he was a prolific letter writer who chronicled what happened in Sharpsburg. Very personal stories, not just of him, but his neighbors. and he sent many of these letters to distant relatives to keep them up to date on what was going on in town. His son, Morgan Miller, also became successful, but not as a farmer. He did own some farmland. He was skilled in the practice of law. He was a justice of the peace, and he held a title as a conveyancer. Okay, if we jump down to the third bullet, we can see what conveyancing is. It's the transfer of legal title of property from one person to another, and granting of encumbrances, mortgages, liens, and sometimes held sales by auctions. Morgan was the executor of the estate of Jacob Miller. Remember, Jacob died in 1875. For some reason, Morgan was not able to close the estate until 1884. So, who lived at that corner in yellow? Morgan Miller lived there. Would Morgan Miller have held auctions at that location? Yes. Could the platform have belonged to Morgan Miller, the platform described by Lee Barron? Quite probably. Okay, so here are some of the questions that we've been talking about, or saying that we're going to address in part 2. Could the stone have been a fixture used by a Sharpsburg auctioneer at his place of business? In particular, let's be specific, Morgan Miller's. Could this stone have migrated from Morgan Miller's place of business to that corner? All right. I don't think so. I think it was placed there as a carriage stone. The plaque says it's been a famous landmark at that location for 150 years. Now, you can't believe everything that you see on this plaque, but I can believe that that stone was placed there as a carriage stone for a much longer period than it existed as an old slave block. Where did it come from? We'll probably never know the answer to that. It was carved at some point and placed on that corner. Who placed it where it is today? Again, a question that's been lost to the ages. But this one we know. How did the brass plate come to be placed on it? Now, I told you I gave this presentation March 12th of this year, 2020. On March 13th, a gift was handed to me. A friend, historian, and researcher, Dr. Emily Ampt of Hood College, sent this article to me. She had gone home from the presentation that I made on the 12th, and she dug in. And this is what she found and sent to me and what I woke up to on the morning of March 13th. This is a picture again of Walter Snyder, and this article was from the newspaper, the Morning Herald, the day before the previous one, June 20th, 1957. All right. Now, I'll read this to you because you might not be able to see it as well as I can. It's not all that great for me. But Walter Snyder has been communicating with Sinclair Oil Refining. And Sinclair Refining Company says this. They say the block will be allowed to remain and it will be marked with a suitable plaque after the gas station is in operation. Okay, so we know that happened. That plaque is there. We've all seen it. Maybe we haven't also. We've seen it in this presentation. And then it goes on. Standing beside it, the block, is Walter Snyder, 80-year-old repository of lore concerning Sharpsburg's past. I have no doubt of that. One story of the block he heard as a lad was that a slave in the town was so broken-hearted over the sale of his sweetheart from the stone that he hanged himself in a home a few doors away. And then it becomes gruesome, kind of. The suicide rope was kept for years afterward. Mr. Snyder said he remembers seeing it as a young boy decades ago. So we have parts of this story are now coming to life. Okay, we know the Sinclair Oil Refining Company plans to place the plaque. We know that there's a plaque on there. So they're the ones. Now we have an answer to the questions we asked earlier. Who would be careless with the history? Who would get the dates wrong? Who would be able to afford to do that? Sinclair Oil Refining, okay? They had a business interest in this stone, not a historical interest. And they were a little bit careless with the dates. I think they were also careless in saying it's been a famous landmark at this location for over 150 years, and more of that will come out as we move through the final part of this presentation. So, here's the story from Walter Snyder. Remember, he told us that he remembered him being told that an enslaved person hung himself. This article happens to be from the Baltimore Sun, October 10, 1859. It also happened to run in other newspapers. This was a very common thing. Newspapers would pick up a story from another paper and they would print it, okay? Almost word for word. But here's the article. A valuable slave man belonging to Mr. Benton of Sharpsburg, Maryland, hung himself on Monday night last in consequence of his master refusing to sell him to go south with a colored girl upon whom his heart's affections had been placed. All right. This is a verification. Now we can see that Walter Snyder was told this story. It says he's a repository of folklore, of lore, of Sharpsburg. Yes, he absolutely is. And he's a repository of this particular story, which is a true story. And it's fascinating to contemplate that. So let's look into the other parts of what that article says. It says a Mr. Benton of Sharpsburg was the owner of this enslaved young male. Well, there was a gentleman in Sharpsburg named Leven Benton who owned a 25-year-old enslaved male. And that young enslaved male was named Levi Brooks. Now, on June 13th, a few weeks ago, I woke up one morning and I thought about this again. I've done it before, but I thought about it a little differently this time. Why would there be an auction even held at this corner? Look at the tightness of the location between the block, the street, the house. And posts have been on this corner in different places. There's a telephone pole right there on the corner at this time. But why this location? Wouldn't it make more sense if you were going to have a dedicated stone for the auction of enslaved people, for it to be in a better location for commercial reasons, just for commercial success? I started to think about that, and within seconds I had an answer, and I'm not sure why I hadn't thought of it before. But the answer is quite simple. Jacob Miller. Jacob Miller is the key to the beginning of this legend, this story about the old slave block. In part one, do you remember sheriff sales? Where did I say that they were held? Where were they held? In fact, for any types of those sales, where did it always come back to? It always came back to a location of either an auctioneer or the residence of the person whose property was being sold. And it became very apparent because the connections for me on June 13th came very quickly. Because I also remembered that Jacob Miller, in his letters, had described where a sheriff had come to his house and seized his property because he owed a debt. He owed a debt. And so this was a sheriff levying on his property to sell it. And where is the sale going to take place? It's going to take place right there in front of his house. They were sold. These 6 enslaved people were sold. Jacob Miller describes this in his letter dated August 10th, 1859. He lists the names of his enslaved people who were sold. Aaron, John, Nair. I'm sorry, Jacob's writing is not exactly perfect, and I'm not sure if that's the correct spelling. But Aaron, John, Nair, Jane, an infant, and Harriet. They were sold by the sheriff to a trader to send them south. Remember, that's the story also from the newspaper article. These enslaved people that lead to the broken-hearted Levi Brooks, they are going south. Jacob Miller says in his letter of August 10th, 1859, that these enslaved people are going south. I'm wondering if Levi Brooks had a relationship with Jane and perhaps was the father of the infant and was quite distraught. Even enslaved people locally at the time understood that they would not have, their life would be much, much harder in the South as they moved to the South. Jacob went on in his letter and wrote that Aaron was his teamster and took care of the horses. He wrote specifically, "The auction deprived me in my old age of having a boy to bring in my horse when I come home." I wonder if he meant from the carriage block, where it would have been easy for him to dismount and go in his front door. Also, keep in mind, in 1859, Jacob is now how old? He's 78 years old, almost 80 years old, late 70s. So it would have been quite a convenience for him to simply get off his horse from that carriage step and go in his front door and have the enslaved Aaron to take care of his horse and take it to where whatever stall it would reside in. It does seem probable that this is the beginning of the old slave block story because we don't have any other connection. We don't have any evidence at all that it was used for a large commercial slave auction. We don't have any evidence that it was used for any of these other types of things, public sale, estate sale. We have this one thing. We have this one sheriff's sale. So yes, it is a carriage step. And it's also a carriage step that may have once been used for a sheriff's sale with tragic consequences and with great historical importance. I thank you for sticking with me through this. I have some work to do. These are the things that I want to try to find next, and I've already been at work on it for the past 2 weeks now. I need to locate the records of the sheriff's sale. Hopefully those records exist within the Maryland court system somewhere. It would be great to iron out and determine what happened to Aaron, John, Nair, Jane and the infant, and Harriet. What happened to them? And then importantly, and this hopefully is right under our noses, where is Levi Brooks buried? Where is his final resting place? These are all questions hopefully to be answered soon. And as I said at the very beginning, this is a work in progress. So I hope that I'm able to achieve some measure of finding information to give us direction with respect to each one of these questions. I hope you have questions. I hope I've raised those. I hope that they're thoughtful, respectful of the history of Sharpsburg, of the people who live there. We can have different opinions. We can't really have different opinions, though, when it comes to our actual history, what we know. I thank you for your attention. I hope that we can have a story, a collective story that everyone can accept, that everyone can find some comfort in and find some truth in. I hope you'll feel free, please, if you have questions or if you have other information that you want to contribute, contact me at aspa91762@gmail.com. Again, I can't thank you enough for your attention today, and I hope to be hearing from you in the near future. Thank you so much.